welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. Chris, it is a new movie. What did you choose to torture us with today?
Well, Dan, I wasn't too sure on this choice at first, but the more I learned about it, the kind of more sucked in I got to the story behind this movie. It's called The Little Things, and it was released both theatrically and on HBO Max simultaneously this past Friday. And it's one of those films where, I heard it's a crime movie. It's got Denzel in it, and I easily could have brushed that off. But then the more I learned that this was a movie that was kind of stuck in development hell for a better part of 3 decades. And that seems like it's right up our alley, since what we do here at Film Trace is trace the life of a film. And we've talked a lot about, I feel like we've maybe overused the phrase gestation period on this show, but this is what it's all about. What the heck happened?
Well, I think you make a really good point. Like we kind of go back and forth between movies we think we're going to like and not going to like. But like at the end of the day, it's stories like this or films like this that are really fun to talk about, because you get to talk about the background of how a film comes into being, which is kind of what this is all about. Yeah, we talk about what people think about it and its cultural importance, but a big part of why we do this is to sort of really talk about the production aspect of it. How do you go from an idea in your head to, a $30 million budget and all these people involved in a huge premiere and millions of people seeing it? I mean, it's a really fascinating process. And with The Little Things too, it's especially fascinating because you have a lot of sort of big Hollywood players here. You got Denzel Washington involved. You get some newcomers like Rami Maleck, and kind of what do you call Jared Leto? What is that, like a hanger on? Like I don't even know.
I like that, hanger on, Hollywood wallflower. Yeah,
he's just there sometimes. Sometimes he's doing music. Sometimes he's doing whatever. He isn't. I will say this: Denzel Washington, Rami Maleck, Jared Leto, all Academy Award winners for acting.
Yes.
Which, I think Denzel's probably the only one among that group that really deserves it, but neither here nor there. And anyway, so, this movie, John Lee Hancock, who I don't think he's a well-known name. Would you say that he's a well-known name? I don't think that he is.
Absolutely not.
But he's done a lot that you probably heard of, though, right? Like he wrote Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, not the book, but the script, the adaptation. He directed The Rookie in 2002, Alamo. I don't remember that movie. I kind of remembering that movie, if that makes sense. He did The Blind Side, gross. Seven White and the Huntsman he wrote, Saving Mr. Banks, The Founder, which is a movie that I think should have got more hype than it did, but for some reason didn't really get the Oscar buzz that it probably was going for. Highwaymen, which I think every male above 65 and white in America has seen on Netflix. I've watched like half of it. That's all I could get through. But he's kind of he's been a journeyman director and writer. Essentially, he's a really much the epitome of an insider. And this is a script he wrote back in 1993. He says, I think he registered it. So this thing's been around for a while. Why do you think, kind of to think about the conception here and who else is involved? Why do you think it took so long for this thing really to take off?
It's interesting because it seemed like this was gunning for a theatrical release traditionally, right? Pre-pandemic. And why, it suddenly came out of nowhere. Like it did seem like maybe he got a lot of eyeballs on the Highwaymen last year, and maybe and he was director only on that one and director only on The Founder in 2016. So, he hadn't really been doing his whole writer director thing. Like that kind of fell apart, it seems, shortly after The Blind Side. And he kind of became kind of that cemented him as that Hollywood insider type. But then when the success of the streaming film The Highwaymen with Kevin Costner happened, it was him reuniting with the star of his initial breakthrough film, A Perfect World, back in 93, which I would say is probably still his best film. I'm not sure. Have you seen that one?
I saw it a long time ago, but I remember liking that it's a pretty decent movie.
Yeah. But once again, like he doesn't really play with like extraordinary. He's very much feels like he's a Clint Eastwood contemporary in that sense, where it's kind of like he's doing a job and he tries to do it well enough. But I don't know if it was just like he got a little bit more cachet with the success of the Highwaymen, and so he was able to like kind of go back into the drawer, so to speak. It seemed like Scott Frank played a big role in making him dust it off, and then getting Denzel interested in the lead role. It's one of those things where it's, a confluence of events, but probably the most fascinating thing about this movie is, you think crime movie and it's not based on a true story or anything like that. If a movie languishes for so long, you'd want to update it, but that basically would just completely tear apart the crux of the film because it takes place, or it was written pre, DNA, used as a marker of solving the mystery, and that basically relegated him to either scrap the thing completely and turn it inside out, or just make it set in the early 90s before DNA became a common way of catching criminals. So it's a very strange thing because it says it's takes place in 1990. It was written in the early 90s, and yet there feels to be little to no reason other than plot convenience to have it set in 1990. Before we get too far, Dan, maybe we should tell the listeners, in case you don't know about the little things, what is the story that's being told here? What's the crime, the central mystery?
I'm reading this plot. I don't know where he got this plot from, but I'm going to read it. Deputy Sheriff Joe Deacon joins forces with Sergeant Jim Baxter to search for a serial killer who is terrorizing Los Angeles. As they track the culprit, Baxter is unaware that the investigation is dredging up echoes of Deke's past, uncovering disturbing secrets that could threaten more than his case. That's a pretty good plot summary.
Doesn't give too much away.
Not too much away. I mean, you kind of know what you're getting. There's an old cop here. There's a young cop. That dynamic, which we all love. Everybody loves that sort of team up, just like Seven. And I mean, that's interesting too. People bring up Seven with this movie constantly, and I
Zodiac.
get why, right? And Zodiac, yeah, because it has it's the serial killer thing. Specifically Seven though, because it came out in the 90s and has such a 90s feel to it. With this one, it felt like there was a moment when this probably should have gotten made in like 1995, 1996. And there were all these crazy people attached to it. Steven Spielberg was originally supposed to direct this. Like, he was the guy who was attached to the script, but apparently he passed on it because he had just done Schindler's List, didn't want to do something else that was super dark. Clint Eastwood was attached to it. Warren Beatty was attached to it for a while. Danny DeVito, when he was directing, was attached to it. So it definitely had a ton of cachet in the beginning of its life cycle here in the 90s. But for whatever reason, it just never really clicked. And I kind of wonder if it didn't click and didn't get made because people thought there were problems with the quality of the script itself, because I think when we get back down to like the release and reception, that's going to be like a big red flag that comes up over and over again when people talk about this film and criticisms about it. The script just has some problems, and some of it is sure related to the fact that it was written in the early 90s and now it's a period piece about 1990. That's very hard to do, I feel like, because like, does it really call out any sort of 1990 period piece? Like, are there any flags in the movie besides like payphones and like?
Well, and the only like specific reference in the script was to the Night Stalker, which had just gotten caught maybe 3 years prior, 87, I believe, and so there was maybe, but it was a very like, it was a blip on the radar in the script, and I was just waiting for there to be some kind of mention of like maybe the race tensions in the early 90s LA, riots.
Oh, good point. Yeah,
like that to ground it. But there were so many things going on in this film that just kept me forgetting that this was set in 1990, even down to like the pretty modern suits that the majority of the characters wore.
I would be really interested to see if we got like a younger person, like a Zoomer, like under 25, to watch this and be like, when do you think this takes place? Like, just give like a scene, and they'll be like, oh, I don't know, 2013. Like,
exactly,
because it kind of has that feeling. That's a good point about the suits too. Like, they're very well tailored. That was not the case back in the 90s, especially early 90s.
Right.
One question I have about all this is sort of, it makes sense that it's getting made now because there's just this insane demand for content. And like this has just been sitting around, and it sounds like, I think he did this really in-depth interview with Deadline, and they talk about like how it came to be, and essentially what happens. It sounds like Warner Brothers was interested in doing it. They sent it around to all the people at Warner Brothers to read. They liked it so much that they were like, hey, we like this enough where we're not going to let it go to another studio, but we might not make it. And then it just sounds like they needed something to do. They needed a project to take off. And there's a really funny line. I can't remember what interview it was in, but it was basically like Warner Brothers applied for a California tax credit. And like, because it went through, they said yes. It was essentially the gist of how this thing really, that's the actual spark to this movie. It comes down to a tax write-off, which, kind of makes sense in the era that we're living now, where like they just need content to fill up the screen. They need those HBO Max subscribers. I mean, Wonder Woman 1984 has been a huge success to get subscribers to HBO Max. And this is, I believe this is the first 2021 Warner Brothers movie that is doing this joint release, right?
Yeah,
like that was supposed to be in the theaters exclusively. So I think this is the first one outside of Wonder Woman, which had already been announced way before. Right. So that was a given. But this is kind of like the first one where that, and we'll get to that whole disaster later on and how this director dealt with it and the actors dealt with it as well. So it is, one of those multiple releases here in theaters and on streaming. Any sort of tidbits from the script or anything about the conception that sort of stuck out to you as sort of odd or weird or interesting?
I mean, just to piggyback off of what we were saying about the setting, it's one of those films where you think that it's going to make the city a character, right? And
yeah,
and I had high hopes, to be honest. In like some of those opening shots, there's some really beautiful like sunset, time lapse photography going on, but then they pretty much drop it immediately, and you're essentially either in like a seedy hotel or at the police department, which for some reason has floor to ceiling windows in 1990, and it just like everything feels slightly off. He has a quote in that same Deadline interview that you referenced. Hancock says, it wasn't the Hollywood of today. It was a lot more rundown. Some locations changed because they were real in 92 and now are very gentrified. And like, that's a whole other issue that it seems strange for him to even bring up in the interview, because there's the classic, like even like bordering on 80s or 70s style, a hotel run by the hour with like a grate at the front desk and prostitutes outside, where it's like it seems like that's the only place where it's taking place in the past, but it's also like not even quite 1990, like it's shooting for like 1981 or something. I don't know.
He tried to do something. He talked like that divide between the Valley and East LA, and him being from Bakersfield. I mean, he does a pretty decent job of laying that out, but like if you don't know LA in that area, it kind of doesn't, you don't know. How would you know that?
Right.
Right. Like, how would you know about like you wouldn't really know how close they are. He just seems like he's from like general country. He's like a country sheriff, and now he's going into the city where he used to work. Right. And I think there was an attempt. I will say there definitely was an attempt to build that sort of visual narrative geography. I think it failed pretty poorly to really pull that off. And I think in general, when looking at sort of the script and how he talks about the script and all that kind of sort of stuff, I am really drawn towards his sort of insistence and confidence that he was doing something interesting here, and he talks about this over and over again about how, and specifically the ending. Like, if you haven't seen the movie, we're probably going to mention the ending. So go watch the movie, then come back to the podcast. You can listen, or just keep listening and spoil it. It's not that big of a deal. The ending of the film, he sort of sees as this really unorthodox thing. And he sort of quotes the idea that, like, the first 2/3 of a detective movie is really interesting and fun. They're searching for the killer. There's clues, and then they find out who it is at the sort of the denouement, and then it's just the rest, like a fight between the good guy and bad guy. And he really goes out of his way to say, no, I didn't want to do that. I couldn't do that. Really, the whole crux of the film was that the ending was going to be ambiguous and it wasn't going to be a good guy versus bad guy situation. And he also sort of states that if he had done that, studios would have made the film earlier. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason that he gives, that the script hadn't been made for 30 years now. I don't really buy that. And I also don't buy what he did here was all that interesting in terms of the ending. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think that he did something here? Well, it's just in terms of the script and the conception of what he was trying to achieve, especially with the ending being ambiguous. Is there something interesting and fascinating there going on, or is it sort of him kind of being pretentious?
It's it's a little of both in my perception. I do think that maybe I had a little bit of a whiplash watching this movie because I was so bored by the first two acts, and pretty much just watching it for those nice photography moments or the Thomas Newman score. Even though it was kind of all over the place, it was at least nice to listen to. But then when something different than what I had expected finally occurred in the third act, they kind of pull the rug out from under you. The number one suspect is suddenly killed, and so you don't know if he was actually had anything to do with the crimes that they had been tracking. And then it becomes a movie about the detectives, and whether or not they are, quote, the good guys, because then they try to cover up the murder of the murder suspect. And just saying it out loud makes you realize that, yeah, you're right. It's not that interesting, but it kind of tricks you, because at least it tricked me, because I was at least like, oh, at least this isn't just, ramping up. It literally shows is a showdown in the middle of the desert, where apparently, you can have giant mounds of dirt and get away with murder. But you end up getting so sidetracked with this new direction the movie takes, at least in the moment. I keep going back and forth on it in my memory of revisiting the film. It's definitely one of those movies where I'm like, I'm never going to watch that again, but at least it didn't just, have a rote ending, even though everything before that was rote. And just because it's not rote doesn't mean that it's interesting, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know. I think the genre of crime thriller is known for trying to throw you off, right? That's almost one of the genre conventions, is that it wants to surprise you. You kind of know where it's going. You think who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, there's red herring, stuff like that. But then, that gets us a deeper conversation about genre. It's like, oftentimes they will fulfill your expectations, but in an interesting way. Here, they don't fulfill your expectations. Hancock does not do that. Mm-hmm. And he also does it kind of, I would say, in an interesting way. I don't think it's in a very effective way. The ending, I'm not going to get into yet, but I feel like it was, I don't know. I think there's a lot that did not go well with this movie. The least of all was probably its ending. There's a lot of other things that I think are problematic. But before we get into that, let's talk about this is a character study, essentially. This is a showcase for actors. So in terms of the production and how they got into their characters, obviously Denzel put on some weight, right?
Yeah.
He really looks run down. I mean, how much weight do you think he put on for this? Like 30, 40 pounds?
Yeah, it seems like it.
I love this quote that I think you added from Cinema Blend from Denzel. This is the Joe Deacon diet. The sacrifices I made for my character. Gaining the weight, that's a piece of cake. Literally a piece of cake. Eating big late, it's not healthy, but it works. Milkshakes were my friend. Ice cream was my very good friend. That's not, I mean, it's like, he really went all in. And then there's this whole other thing that Hancock goes into about how Denzel was so dedicated to the script.
Right.
And adding notes, and that he was so into it that he gave him an office on the Warner Brothers lot next to him, and they would talk for hours. I watched this movie and I'm like, and some of the reviewers I think kind of called this out, he's phoning this in.
Yeah,
this is not Denzel at all, at the sort of Denzel and I will say this, I think Denzel is probably one of the greater or better actors of the last 30 years. Like, he's an amazing talent, and he shows up in these terrible movies,
Right.
and really hits a home run like every time. Like, is The Equalizer a good movie, or Equalizer 2? No, they're not good movies. But like, he does such a good job that, he carries those films here, despite him, spending days and hours talking with Hancock about the script and gaining all this weight, like, really to get into it. I think he falls really far short of what this character is doing. I don't know why that is. Like, I'm not an actor, I'm not really in that field or world, but to me, he fell very far short of the sort of hauntedness that is required for a role like this.
And I was struggling during the film trying to figure out if it was Denzel phoning it in or if it was a problem with the script, because there wasn't a lot given to him.
Good point.
And also, just like you have him in that dumpy, seedy hotel without much of any explanation, and a single tear runs down his face as he's looking at pinned up photos on a wall, and it's just
it's so cliche.
Exactly, it's so cliche. It's like, but also, I mean, it's hard to tell. It's also hard to tell when Denzel is trying to aim for something understated. Right.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And because he's such an over the top actor, and you're right, like, that's what he's become known for. And it's legitimate because melodrama works in things like Malcolm X or Inside Man. But it's not what John Lee Hancock is going for here. He wants something understated. If anything, the kind of big performance is supposed to be coming from Rami Malek's character. And that's a whole other bag of.
Dive into that bag for me, because I really want to dive into that bag right now.
Oh my gosh.
I want your reaction first to his performance. I mean, first of all, before we get into Rami, like, do you like him as an actor in general?
I thought I did when I was watching Mr. Robot, but anything else I've seen him in, everything else I've seen him in, he's terrible.
Like, Mr. Robot is I think is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. I think he is unbelievable in that role. Other stuff that I've seen, I would agree. Like, I just don't here. I mean, here, I think he is incredibly bad.
Yeah.
I don't think that he fits this. I think he's completely miscast.
Yes.
Like, and I think you have a quote. What's the quote you have here from IndieWire? I think. What he says, Maleck saw his character as a departure from the things I usually do. He's a guy who does things by the numbers until he doesn't. I like to see this crisp, clean, meticulous looking guy start to unravel, not only inside, but out toward the end.
Yeah.
Where did it go wrong? I think we're in agreement that there's probably a miscast here.
Definitely.
Why do you think it doesn't work?
I mean, I think it doesn't work because it almost feels like there was some kind of inclination on Lee Hancock's part to do some kind of almost like meta postmodern play on a lot of these cliches from the crime genre, but he's just not adept enough. He doesn't have his own voice enough, really, because he's kind of been this hired hand for so long to really make that work on any kind of deeper intellectual level. And so it ends up just being like, okay, play it straight and as serious as you can, and then let the script take care of itself. But then the script's got its own issues, and so it just kind of it ends up falling flat all over the place. I mean, I'm trying to think, like, even like a Colin Farrell or something in this role, how much could he have made up for the fact that there's so little on the script?
A lot, I feel like.
You think so?
A lot. I think so, yeah. I mean, like, the script's not good. But it's like the script's not good, and I think kind of the ways that you're talking about, it tries to do something interesting and special and definitely falls short and ends up being very rote, which is trying to do exactly what it wasn't doing, being cliche. But I think if you get a good actor in there and give him some room, I honestly think that Denzel's performance is so poor because Rami Maleck is so poor. I feel like he has nothing to play off of. And despite the fact that Rami Maleck is a Best Actor winner for Bohemian Rhapsody,
we don't need to mention it.
I have to mention it every time. Denzel Washington and Hancock chose Rami Maleck together. Like, so they made that choice and said, hey, he's going to be like, he's a good guy. In what world does Rami Maleck come across as like a straight shooter, up and coming detective. And like that guy is a by the book guy. That's a Guy Pearce in LA Confidential.
Yeah,
who was
exactly.
perfect for that role. A very specific kind of like vibe to him. Rami Maleck has a neurotic vibe. That's not the vibe of an all-star detective.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That makes no sense. And like the problem there is like and this goes back to kind of like genre. If you don't buy into certain characterizations and genre tropes, you lose the audience and you lose the sort of foundation that genre gives you to create a story and then experiment. If you don't have that foundation there, then it's like you can't really do all that much because it doesn't click with people. And I think that's one of the big issues here is just like super miscast. I think the casting of Denzel was good. I think his performance was poor and the writing was poor. Rami to me is so miscast that it almost ruins the entire movie for me. What about the elephant in the room, Jared Leto? I really am interested to see how you thought his performance was here as the big bad.
I mean, yeah, so he plays the murder suspect that, it's kind of a cat and mouse game. Yeah, and that's the key word, right, is because of the rug that gets pulled out from under you in that third act. I mean, he's fun to watch. I'll give him that. And I think we were texting a little bit about the movie, and I think you said that he's the best part of at least among those three central roles.
Did I say that? Okay.
And I don't think I disagree with that, but at the same time, it's also I feel he's such a weird performer to nail down because like I just keep having it running through my head. There's this moment during what's supposed to be a very emotionally cathartic and climactic scene that just ends with a beat and then Jared Leto saying "oh poop," and then he repeats that saying "oh poop" again while they're in the middle of the desert at the middle of the night with like a shovel and mounds of dirt, and Rami Malek's all sweaty, and it's just it's I have no idea how to classify or how to like just understand what's going on other than it's just like at least he's going for something. You got to give him that.
I mean, I love his performance in this. I think it is just wonderful. And that's like, it's the perfect. So Jared Leto is just like, I don't know how you would classify him as a person. Like he does everything. He does music. He's a real Renaissance man. He thinks very, very highly of himself. Like he is the paradigm of head up his ass actor. And he does go all into these roles, and a lot of the times that doesn't work. Like Blade Runner 2049, remember that disaster that he's terrible in that. You're just like, what are you doing, man? And he's been in a lot of stuff, some of it good, some of it bad. He win for a Dallas Buyers Club, which I thought he was actually really good in. Oh no,
but that's when I think he's like swinging for the fences and not realizing.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I could see how. I don't know. I dig his commitment, and I know that it's super pretentious. But I get like here to me he nails it in the sense that like the whole point of this character within this script and this narrative world is to be that weirdo guy to throw you off. Yeah. He's there not only to throw off the audience, but also to throw off the characters. And he does that very successfully. And Leto is such a weirdo and kind of a freak of a person that he's able to get there very easily, and he's comfortable in it. He's comfortable being this absolute off the wall, just nutso. And to me, it worked. It was absolutely my favorite part of the film, because up until that point, I was like, this is one of the boringest movies I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, he doesn't show up until like the midway point.
Yeah, he doesn't show up until midway. And I was like, even like the first scene where he's in that like the repair shop and you see him
just
like,
peeking around.
Oh, yeah, like peeking around. I was like, I want more of that. I want more of that vibe. Yeah. But no, I think he was fantastic. And there was I didn't put it down here, but there was a funny article about how Denzel was like kind of like stayed away from Jared Leto on set. It was like it didn't want to be around him. It just kind of let him do his thing, which I think makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of stories. What's the story about him in Suicide Squad? Do you remember this?
Yeah, he would like put dead rats in people's trailers or something like that.
Yeah, he's kind of infamous for being a real. People keep calling it method. That's not method. No, he's just being a jerk. Like he's just being a complete asshole. Yeah, that's not method at all. But I think to me, that's one of the things that worked of the casting and thinking about the production of this. Like that to me is one of the things that worked the best here. And I think a lot of that has to do with Hancock, kind of like letting him do his thing and guiding him a bit. And even what does Leto say here? He'd like, he would give, Hancock would give notes between takes. He was completely open to trying anything and everything that I put in his ear. That's Hancock talking about Leto. And I think that really, shows up on screen and kind of in a somewhat of a unique and special performance, to say the least.
Memorable for sure. At least memorable.
Memorable for sure. What about the release? Like, how is this thing doing?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, it's, let's talk about the critical reception. Let's talk about this weird release that happened.
Yeah. Maybe let's just as a quick primer for people that weren't kind of aware of this curveball that came from Warner Brothers and HBO Max. When did they maybe announce this? Like November or something?
I want to say it was maybe around then, like November, December, somewhere
maybe
there.
Closer to December. But basically, curveball out of nowhere. They just announced they're 11 movies, maybe more than that now. 20.
It's more. It's the entire slate. I think
the entire slate. They announced a small number first, and then they expanded it. So basically, their entire plan for the end of 2020 and the rest of 2021 is to have these 30-day windows where on release date, the movie would be available both on HBO Max for 30 days as well as in theaters. And then after 30 days, it would expire. It would only be in theaters. And then it would go through the usual steps of, eventually making its way to VOD and streaming. And so probably the most controversial thing about this choice was that the filmmakers and stars of these titles had no say in the matter. It was just as much of a surprise it was to the public as it was to them. And that was clearly felt by the cast and crew of this movie, because, I mean, you can just by the way we've been talking about how old school Hollywood it is. It's literally a script from the early 90s. I mean, pandemic or not, it seemed like this was the kind of movie that everybody would just assume would, come out, maybe debut to a handful million of dollars and then slowly fade away. But I mean, there's a lot of complaining that went on, mostly on Denzel's side. It seemed like Hancock, he had a quote where he says he's trying to be zen about it. You can't control it, pandemic and what have you, learning 20 minutes before the press release. And ultimately, I know, I'm curious what you think, Dan. I think they're the better for it. Way more people are talking about this movie than if we had waited a year until the pandemic died down and it just came out regularly in the theater.
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of ways you look at it, but I think, definitely, it's the number one movie on HBO Max right now. HBO Max is super happy with its performance so far. So I think from just an eyeballs perspective, it's doing very well. Also, even the box office is not that bad. It did $4.3 million. Who the hell is going to a movie theater? Come on, people. Don't go to a movie theater.
To see a movie that you could get free trial.
It's on HBO Max. Spend the $12 and watch it at home until you get vaccinated. There's that part of it. But I think the weirder part about the whole HBO thing is that it's clearly a ploy just to grow the HBO Max subscriber base at the cost of a lot of revenue. And one of the issues here is sort of why would you put it on HBO Max, which is, how much is HBO Max a month? $14, $15?
Yeah, $14.99, I believe.
$14.99. So okay, great. Why would you put it in theaters and this SVOD service first? Why wouldn't you put it on PVOD and have people pay $15 to see it? If you realize, see it for the first couple of months, and then put on HBO Max in 3 months or whatever. And the fact that they didn't get the okay, especially the legal okay, to do this is insane. And there's tons of lawsuits going back and forth. He hung up on the phone, and he says he basically hung up on the phone with these people who told him this, and basically he didn't know how to react. I think because he was pretty upset about it. And I think a lot of the actors are upset. And when this happened, remember, all these directors came out and they were livid. Nolan was vicious. And when it's Nolan, come on, he made Tenet, genius. But so I think, it's a really mixed bag. Ultimately, it's not going to make anywhere near the money it would have made if there was no pandemic and it just got released in theaters, but there is a pandemic, right? So it changes completely, and you're not going to sit on this thing for another year. I mean, they sat on it for 30 years. So maybe
another year?
Yeah, that's another year. Just and it really could come out whenever. Like, what if you just held this till October 2021? Most people will be vaccinated by then. I think movie theaters will be somewhat open by then. It could have opened easily to 20-30 million bucks easily. I mean, Denzel, he can open any movie to like 40 million. And it's so like, I think it's a really, I think they, it's one of those situations where they wanted to get it out the door as soon as possible. And this is all about growing the subscriber base of HBO Max 100%. There's no other reason why they're doing this, especially for a movie like this. And I think it's going to work. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to be successful, at least in that aspect. I didn't like this movie at all. I hated it. What did critics think?
Yeah, this is probably one of the lower rated ones we've gone over on the show in a while.
It is, yeah.
Rotten Tomato, all critics score 48%, real score 56 out of 100, top critics 45, real score 57 out of 100, Metacritic 54 out of 100. A sub 60 is just gonna it's not long for this world, folks. The Rotten Tomatoes audience score, not much better, 59%, real score 74 out of 100, and Letterboxd score, the film nerds, film snobs, 54, pretty bad. IMDb 64, that's your best score. Cinema score of a B-, which is also still not great, and a Metacritic audience score of a 64 as well. What is I mean, if John Lee Hancock wasn't making it for the audience or the producer, he was making it for the critics. So why do you think, Dan, he didn't even score with them?
Because it's trite and it's boring. Like, it's not an interesting film. I think just from a script perspective, it is incredibly not good. Like, this reminds me of a script that I would have read in like an old script writing competition, and you'd be like, wait, is this an actual script, or are you testing me whether I know how to like rate scripts or not? It's that bad. Like, it feels like one of those scripts. And like, I don't know, like, he is somebody who, and this is going to sound so insulting, but I don't care. He is essentially, a hired hand director. Mm-hmm. Right, like, he's just there to sort of be on set, eat a nice bagel in the morning on set and sort of say action and cut and stuff like that, and he just keeps the train on the tracks. He is not a Fincher. He is not a Paul Thomas Anderson. He is not a Wes Anderson. Like, he is not a director that's going to put his stamp. He doesn't. And the question is, what confuses me about that is he seems like he has a lot to say. Because in the interview, I'm reading the interview, I'm like, you're talking about a way better movie than the one that I just saw. Mm-hmm. So like, what happened in between like your ideas and your creative input and the actual output? I kind of wonder if he wasn't sort of ruined to some degree by the system, where he kind of understands the studio system, what the producers or the higher ups really want, and he sort of really sands off the edges of his ideas, because I think he's a really smart, creative guy, but this end product is just, to me, it's inept. It's just like totally flaccid and just not there. And then I think, it's a failure on the critical side of things. And like you said, like, you look at the cinema score, which, whatever, it's a small sample size, but like, it's worse than all these other Denzel movies, like Equalizer, which got an A, or sorry, Equalizer 2 got an A, Equalizer 1 got an A-, Two Guns, I don't even know what that is. That got a B+. Safe House, I have no idea what that is, got an A-. So he's in no man's land. Right, it's the infamous no man's land, where you're trying to make a movie that you think is interesting and cool, but it's not. So the critics and film snobs don't like it, and then it's not cliche enough to get the masses to love it. So he's left where he is, which is a really boring movie.
Right. I do want to mention that Justin Chang, who I think is an amazing film critic out of the LA Times, he was one of the few critics to give it a positive review. The quote you put in here, Dan, I liked a lot, actually, even though I don't agree with it. He wrote, "And while Hancock's movie may not look at first like a hollow retread, I'd describe it as more of an unhollow retread, a movie in which even the hoariest looking conventions have an undertow of a real feeling. It induces the strange sensation of encountering cliches before they were cliches, of opening an unusually well-preserved time capsule, or taking a trip down a corpse-strewn memory lane. We talk a lot on the show about, movies as time capsules, especially when we look at older films. Yeah. And I mean, maybe that's another reason why I was drawn to the movie in the first place, is because I think there are a lot of us out there, especially of a certain generation, that really long for the kind of, Morgan Freeman kiss the girls type movie, but with maybe a little bit more substance. And it was just like it wasn't, either it went through too many edits or not enough, maybe both on different pages. And it just doesn't quite hit that mark.
I think it's interesting too, to put it in sort of context of what we've seen on television.
Yeah,
because like the crime thriller in television has really taken off over the last decade, and you look to something like a True Detective.
I was constantly thinking about True Detective while this movie was.
And like, have you seen all 3 seasons?
Yeah, so
okay.
I mean, it's got the LA setting of season 2, and it's got like the morose journeyman main character of season 3. So it's missing essentially what made True Detective good in the first place, in my opinion anyways, which is the first season of just like the, kooky pretentiousness.
Yeah, no, totally. But I think there's just, even in like season 2, which is universally derided, and I did a rewatch, it's not good. And but it did LA way better than this movie, I'll tell you that much. Yeah. I mean, LA was really a character in season 2. But I think the tough thing about that is, ever since season 1 of that, which is 2014, I want to say, something like that. It really, I think it changed people's perception of the crime thriller and what it could be. Like, that first season was a very existential, sort of macabre, just a really well written and well produced and amazingly acted season of television. And then you kind of relate the vibe of that. Like, I'm thinking about like the shootout scene in the sort of housing projects in season 1, really riveting stuff, like just like amazing.
Yeah.
And then you compare it to this movie. Was there anything in this movie, a single scene in this movie, that got you even halfway there of that scene in True Detective season 1?
No, it was not a set piece driven movie, which is perhaps another reason why it also like felt more at home on a streaming service than in the theaters. I maybe would have been even more disappointed if I had paid $8 and not really got any thrills with the Denzel movie.
Yeah, but it does. The one thing it did remind me of are those 90s crime thrillers.
Yeah.
And not the great ones. It's not a Silence of the Lambs. It's not a Seven. But it does kind of feel like something that would be released on, on a weekend in the movie theaters. I can't even think of an example. Like, I'm thinking like the one that came into my head is like The Pledge. Do you remember that? That was 2000.
Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, Jack Nicholson, haunted cop by the past, all that sort of stuff. It does kind of feel in that realm, but that's 20 years old, right? And I don't know, this film just felt so, as A.A. Dowd said, well, I'll read that review. You added this one, didn't you?
I like this one too.
To enjoy the film on its own cookie cutter terms depends on finding pleasure, guilty or otherwise, in tropes recycled with a total straight-faced conviction. Or maybe to crave comfort food of a variety Hollywood doesn't churn out quite as frequently as it used to. And it's a very good point. There is a comfort food aspect to a movie like this, with Denzel chewing the scenery. Rami Maleck is sort of the upstart actor trying to do something interesting and fast. I mean, is he the Brad Pitt here, I guess?
Right.
And then the weirdo character actor and freak, Jared Leto, just, doing whatever he can do to freak you out. So there's definitely parts of it that I thought were, what's interesting about it to me is I liked so much about this movie except the story. And to me, without that story being good and engaging, the rest of it just feels like a disassembled puzzle at the end of the day. It just doesn't come together at all. And you know what? A kind of another question I have for you, Chris, is, thinking about like crime thrillers and stuff like that, do you think this movie kind of fails because it's out of time and out of place and it never could have worked? Or do you think it's more sort of structural or just writing and stuff like that?
I mean, it was definitely something that was plaguing my mind while watching it. It was constantly waiting or trying to find a reason for it to be in 1990 besides the DNA plot convenience, escape route, basically. And so that kind of did hurt. And maybe that would not have been anywhere near the front of my mind if I was actually watching this in the 1990s. But on the other hand, it does seem like there's such deep structural problems with not just, the story and characters and tropes and roteness of it all, but also specifically with like the amount of talking that happens between characters that feels like it's for a reason. And then when the rug gets pulled out from under you, you realize there is no reason. And maybe that's part of what John Lee Hancock is going for, to kind of signify, maybe he is trying to, that's his spin, like his mainstream spin on existentialism, but it's never cohesive enough to really to land. So ultimately, I think my answer to your question is no, I don't think this could have worked even in the 90s. It would be at most forgettable. And at least now, with the way it's being released and with it being kind of a curio locked in a cabinet script, that at least gives it something interesting to think about, even if it's frustrating.
Yeah. And I think the real question is like, we've already seen how audiences are reacting to it sort of on like an audience score. But when you look at the popularity of it and you look at even the box office of it, it's working. Right. It is a film that is going to increase the HBO Max subscribers by a lot. It is a film that is going to make some money at the box office when no movie's making money at the box office. So even I would say the weird part about that is a substandard product at the end of the day can be successful if it just has some of the right pieces there. It doesn't have to come together. It doesn't have to be even good. It just has to draw your attention, which it did for me too. Like when this first got announced, I was super stoked. I was like, Rami Maleck, yes, I love him. Denzel Washington, sure, he's awesome. Jared Leto, what? This sounds great. Like, sounds like a really interesting, fun. And then it's from Warner Brothers, so it's like a big budget thing. But it doesn't really click. It doesn't come together at all. It's the script is trite beyond belief. But none of that matters. Because when you have certain names attached and a certain production and look to something, it will be successful financially, which is probably one of the more frustrating things about the movie industry is that you can get it sort of right with the right people and the right name on it, and it's going to work. And so, that's kind of the double-edged sword of a movie like this. I don't think it's great, but I think it's a good product at the end of the day, which is the most capitalist thing I could possibly say. Any closing thoughts on the little things that you want to sort of close us out with?
I think we've said enough, and I'm very interested to already start previewing absolute stone cold classic, maybe the best movie we've ever covered on the podcast, which you picked for us to look at next week. That is
a crazy, I like that lead in. So it's the 40th anniversary of Michael Mann's Thief, which came out in 1981, streaming on HBO Max. We are going to sort of talk about that one next week. I'm excited. I didn't realize we're doing two crime movies back to back, but it'll be a good sort of way to sort of play them off of each other. I'm super excited about it. Michael Mann's one of my favorite directors. Music like Tangerine Dream. Come on, James Caan.
I can't wait.
It's going to be fantastic. In any event, folks, thanks for listening. Little Things is playing now on HBO Max, so do check it out if you want to be bored to death. This has been Film Trace.